Hi and welcome back to Heimler's History U.S. Government Edition. Now in this video we're going to talk about federalism, and if there's one idea that confuses students of U.S. government more than any other idea, it's this one. And the thing is, it's not even that it's that hard to understand, it's just that the word federalism is very confusing. But if you confuse the meaning of federalism, you miss out on one of the most fundamental concepts of how our government works. So how about I explain it up real nice for you with some jelly on the side. So what is federalism and why does it matter? Well, I need to begin by telling you that federalism is not what it sounds like. It sounds like we're talking about the federal government, which is to say Big Daddy government who lives in Washington, D.C. So when you go to a party and you get into a conversation, you say you're studying federalism in school, which in my opinion is pretty solid party talk. What the other person is probably thinking is, oh, you're learning about the president and the Supreme Court and the Congress, which is to say the federal government. But hear me, that is not what we are talking about when we talk about federalism. Does federalism mean we're talking about the federal government? How many ways can I say no? If I were German, I'd say nein. If I were South African, I'd say nie. If I were an ancient Roman, I'd say minime. No. Federalism does not mean we're talking about the federal government. So, what does it mean? Federalism is, pure and simple, about the separation of power. Under our particular form of government, it is the people who have the power. And we have consented to giving some of that power to the government. So if the framers of the Constitution decided to take all of that power and jam it into one power sandwich, we'd have what's called a unitary government. There would be one centralized government with one ring to rule them all. But the framers did not do that. They decided to cut that sandwich in two, and that cutting is called federalism. They gave some power to the central government and gave some power to the state's government, and that's all federalism means in our government. Power is divided between the state governments and the national government. So what that means in practice is that national governments and state governments are somewhat independent of one another when it comes to power. But there's also some overlapping areas of concern when it comes to power. For example, the national government is responsible for foreign policy, and the state government is responsible for keeping people safe through a police force. And in that way, the federal government and state governments are largely independent of one another. An example of how these entities share power is the interstate highway system. On these roads, you can travel from state to state, and both the federal government and state governments share responsibility for them. And I can give you 1,000 other examples, but the main point here is that the Constitution made absolute sure that power was separated between the national government and the state government. And so let's look more closely at how it does that. On an initial reading of the Constitution, it may seem like it favors a stronger central government at the expense of state governments. And you might be convinced of that by Article 1, which gives all the powers that Congress has, and the list is pretty long. But when the Constitution talks about state power, the list is relatively short. But the Constitution actually does grant the states substantial power. For example, the 10th Amendment is the haven of state sovereignty, and it reads like this: "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people." But if we look at Article 4 of the Constitution, we can see power shifting more towards the central government. For example, we have the full faith and credit clause, which says that states must respect the laws of other states. And that's pretty nice because it means that I can get into my car here in Georgia, drive clear across the country to California, and I don't have to stop at every state and get a new driver's license, because in each state they will honor my Georgia's driver's license as valid. And another key part of the Constitution for understanding federalism is the 14th Amendment. And it reads this way: "No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." Now, this amendment was passed in the wake of the Civil War, and it was meant to give the federal government power to nullify discriminatory state laws. For example, after the Civil War, Southerners were fond of giving literacy tests meant to bar former slaves from voting. But the 14th Amendment can also work the other way around. For example, in 2013, the Supreme Court struck down part of the Voting Rights Act, and they justified this by saying that the federal government had placed too heavy a burden on the states. Okay, so that's a brief explanation of how federalism works. And as you can imagine, the line between where state sovereignty and where national sovereignty both begin and end has always been a battle. And so it's helpful to see how federalism has evolved over the history of our country. So the first real challenge to our federalist system came in 1819 in a Supreme Court case called McCulloch versus Maryland. Back in those days, Congress established a branch of the National Bank in the state of Maryland. Now, in case you forgot your U.S. history, many states in those days despised the establishment of a national bank. bank. So what Maryland decided to do when Congress put a branch of the national bank in their state was to pass a law that said any bank in that state that was not chartered by the state of Maryland was subject to a hefty annual tax. When the federal government told Maryland to stop it, they found themselves before Chief Justice John Marshal in the Supreme Court. Essentially, Marshal ruled that since the Constitution explicitly gives the federal government the right to coin and regulate money, it also had the right to establish a national bank to handle that money under the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution. And furthermore, once this ruling was handed down, the Supremacy Clause ensured that the decision for the federal government's law would trump that of the state government's laws. Now, since that time, different models of federalism have come and gone. Up till about 1930, we basically operated under a system called dual federalism. And that just basically meant that the national government and the state government operated largely independently of another with just a little bit of overlap in the middle. This is also known as layer cake federalism because when you cut a layer cake, you can see that each layer is its own distinct and sovereign layer. And yes, they both mush together in the middle with that icing, but mainly they are separate entities. And then after the 1930s, especially with the implementation of Roosevelt's New Deal, we moved more into what's called a marble cake federalism. In this kind of federalism, the federal government becomes much more hands-on in areas which previously were solely the domain of states. So, for example, with the rollout of all the New Deal programs, the federal government provided the money for many of those programs, but the states were responsible for making things happen. It's not nearly as clean as a layer cake. You've got power bleeding across the boundaries in both directions. Since that time, federalism has further evolved into what we have today, namely fiscal federalism. And basically what that means is that today, federalism basically operates in terms of money. The federal government provides huge sums of money to states for various programs, but with every check they write to the states, there are strings attached and requirements by which the states must abide if they want the funds. So, for example, in the 1970s, the federal government offered money to the states for highway repair, but in exchange, the states had to agree to set speed limits on those highways to 55 miles an hour. Now let's dig a little further into this idea of fiscal federalism because you hear about it in the news all the time, even if you don't know that's what they're talking about. Today, most of the federal money comes to the states in two forms: categorical grants and block grants. A categorical grant is federal money that must be attached to a specific category of spending, like a school lunch program. But the tricky thing about these is that the federal government can act in coercive ways when giving out these grants. For example, requiring a state to set the drinking age to 21 before giving it funds for highway repair. But block grants are a little less heavy-handed. The federal government gives states block grants that must be used within a specific policy area, like say healthcare, and then lets the state decide how they are going to spend that money within the bounds of that area. Now, I'm not just trying to throw vocabulary at you. These kinds of grants actually illustrate how federalism works today. The reason why the federal government does this is because normally the states wouldn't have access to all that extra money, and that's a win for the states. But in putting conditions on accepting that money, the national government wins because then it can implement its national policies which the states otherwise would not implement. And that's a very good thing. So that's how federalism works, and that's why it's important. And now I don't know about you, but I'm gonna go find me a cake. Alright, thanks for watching. If you learned anything at all, there's a little thumbs up below. Click that and that'll help this video spread to other people who might need some learning. If you're not already subscribed, why don't you go ahead and subscribe? I mean, I can't coerce you, I don't have any money to offer you. All I have to offer is a magnificent beard and some sassy commentary on the American government. And if that's enough for you, then join our little community here by hitting that subscribe button. I'll see you next time.